Have you ever noticed that sometimes the loudest goodbye is the one that never happens? No argument, no explanation, no final message. Just silence. At first, you tell yourself they're probably busy. A few hours become a day. A day becomes a week. Before long, you aren't waiting for a reply anymore. You're searching for a reason. And that's where tonight's investigation begins. Because when someone disappears without saying goodbye, the real mystery isn't what happened to them. It's what happens inside the mind of the person left behind. Welcome to Mind Unraveled. Every episode, we open a new psychological case file, not to decide who's right, not to decide who's wrong, but to understand the invisible forces that shape human behavior. Tonight's file. Case file number 001. The psychology behind disappearing without a goodbye. Let's begin. Meet Daniel. 26 years old. Kind. Reliable. The type of person who remembers birthdays without needing a reminder. The type who checks in on friends simply because they crossed his mind. Several months ago, Daniel met someone online. Nothing unusual. A few conversations became daily conversations. Daily conversations became phone calls. Phone calls became routines. Every morning started with a message. Every evening ended with one. Slowly, without either of them realizing it, this stranger became a part of Daniel's everyday life. Not because of grand romantic gestures, not because of dramatic promises, simply because humans become attached to consistency. Our brains love patterns, and routines quietly become emotional anchors. Then, something changed. Not suddenly, gradually. Replies took a little longer. The conversations became shorter. Questions disappeared. The laughter became polite. The warmth became distant. Daniel noticed, but he explained every change away. Maybe work was stressful. Maybe life had become busy. Maybe he was imagining it. After all, our minds are surprisingly good at protecting relationships we don't want to lose. Then, one Tuesday morning, Daniel sent his usual message. "Good morning." He smiled, locked his phone, and got ready for work. An hour passed. Nothing. Lunch arrived. Still nothing. Night came. Silence. The next morning. Still nothing. Then another day. Then another. Without realizing it, Daniel stopped checking his phone out of habit. He started checking it out of hope. And hope can be a very exhausting emotion. By the third day, Daniel had stopped expecting a notification. Instead, he started asking questions. Questions that didn't have answers. He reopened old conversations, scrolled back through months of messages, read the same jokes they once laughed at together, studied ordinary sentences, as though they were pieces of evidence. Maybe the replies became shorter. Maybe they stopped asking about his day. Maybe that joke wasn't as funny as he remembered. Maybe. Have you ever noticed how quickly the human mind fills empty spaces? Silence leaves room for imagination. And imagination rarely remains neutral. When we don't know the truth, our brains begin creating one. Not because we enjoy overthinking, because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Imagine reading a mystery novel, only to discover the final chapter has been ripped out. Your mind wouldn't simply move on. It would start writing its own ending. Who was the killer? What was the motive? Did the detective survive? The unanswered questions demand attention. Human relationships work in much the same way. An unanswered goodbye becomes an unfinished story. And the human brain hates unfinished stories. Psychologists have studied this tendency for decades. Our minds naturally seek what psychologists call cognitive closure. In simple terms, our brains crave conclusions, even imperfect ones, because certainty almost always feels safer than uncertainty. That's exactly what happened to Daniel. His brain wasn't searching for comfort. It was searching for completion. The problem was that there were no answers to find. So his mind did what every human mind eventually does. It started building theories. Maybe she lost interest. Maybe she met someone else. Maybe she'd been pretending all along. Then, the theories became more personal. Maybe I talked too much. Maybe I wasn't interesting enough. Maybe I should have noticed sooner. Maybe I'm the problem. Notice what happened there. Daniel was no longer trying to understand another person's behavior. He had turned the spotlight onto himself. And that's something almost all of us do. When someone disappears without explanation, our first instinct isn't to investigate their circumstances. It's to investigate our own value. What did I do wrong? Why wasn't I enough? What could I have changed? Those questions feel logical, but they're built on a dangerous assumption that another person's silence must automatically be about you. Human behavior is rarely that simple. Every person you meet is carrying an invisible world, responsibilities, family problems, financial pressure, fear, anxiety, depression, grief, burnout, private battles they may never tell anyone about. Yet the moment someone disappears, our brains quietly erase all those possibilities. Instead, they shine one bright spotlight directly onto ourselves. Not because we're irrational, because we're human. We're storytellers. And when the story is incomplete, our minds instinctively place us at the center. Sometimes, that conclusion is correct. Sometimes, it isn't. The difficult part is that silence rarely tells you which one. So perhaps, we've been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of asking, why did they leave? Maybe we should ask, what could have been happening inside their mind? Because every disappearance has two stories. One belongs to the person left behind, the other belongs to the person who walked away, and until now, we've only examined one side of the case. Let's open the next file, because not everyone disappears. For the same reason, every investigation begins with one dangerous assumption, that there's only one answer. But human behavior doesn't work that way. Two people can perform the exact same action, for completely different reasons. One person may walk away because they're afraid, another because they're overwhelmed, another because they simply don't know how to communicate, and another because they know exactly what they're doing. The action may look identical. The psychology behind it isn't. So let's open the first psychological profile, the conflict avoider. Imagine you've spent days rehearsing a difficult conversation. You know someone is expecting an answer. You know your silence is hurting them. But every time you think about sending the message, your chest tightens. Your heart races. You imagine every possible reaction: anger, disappointment, tears, accusations. The conversation grows larger inside your mind until it feels impossible to start. For people with an avoidant conflict style, the conversation itself becomes the threat. It's not that they enjoy hurting others. It's that they've convinced themselves the temporary discomfort of silence is easier than the immediate discomfort of confrontation. So they wait. I'll reply tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes next week. Next week becomes never. Ironically, the conversation they were trying to avoid becomes far more painful than it ever would have been, because silence doesn't erase difficult conversations. It postpones them, and while one person experiences temporary relief, the other begins carrying permanent questions. That's the tragedy of avoidance. It protects one person, while quietly transferring the emotional burden to someone else. Now, let's open the second profile, the emotionally detached. Not everyone processes relationships with the same emotional intensity. Some people naturally compartmentalize. They move through life without realizing how deeply their actions affect others. They don't wake up planning to hurt anyone. In many cases, They simply underestimate the emotional weight of disappearing. To them, ending a conversation feels small, a message left unanswered, a chapter quietly closed. But to the person on the other side, that same silence becomes something entirely different. A question repeated every night before sleep, a memory replayed during quiet moments, a wound that refuses to explain itself. The event is identical. The emotional experience is completely different. Why? Because people don't experience reality exactly as it happens. They experience reality through the filter of their own history, past relationships, childhood experiences, attachment styles, personal insecurities. Two people can witness the same silence and leave with entirely different stories. One barely remembers it. The other remembers it for years. That's why psychology teaches us something important. Behavior isn't measured only by intention. It's also measured by impact. Someone may never intend to cause pain, yet still leave behind enormous emotional consequences. Understanding that difference doesn't excuse the behavior. It simply helps explain it. And explanation is where every investigation begins. So far, we've met the people who disappear because they fear conflict, and those who disappear because they fail to recognize the impact of their silence. But the next profile may be the one people misunderstand the most. Because sometimes, the person who disappears isn't running from you. They're running from a life that already feels impossible to carry. The third psychological profile is the overwhelmed mind. Imagine trying to keep 10 glass plates spinning at the same time. Work, family, bills, health, responsibilities, expectations, anxiety. One by one, they all demand your attention. Now imagine someone hands you one more plate. Objectively, it isn't heavy, but when your hands are already full, even something light can feel impossible to carry. That's what emotional overload often looks like. From the outside, it may appear as laziness, disinterest, or carelessness. From the inside, it feels like survival. People experiencing severe emotional stress don't always withdraw from one person. Sometimes, they withdraw from everyone. Friends stop receiving replies, family members get ignored, calls go unanswered, plans are canceled. Not because those relationships no longer matter, but because even simple conversations begin to feel exhausting. Something as ordinary as replying to a message becomes another task on an already impossible list. Reply later. I'll answer when I feel better, when things calm down. But sometimes, things don't calm down. Days become weeks, weeks become months, and with every passing day, the guilt grows heavier. Ironically, that guilt often makes replying even harder, because now, it isn't just a message, it's an explanation, an apology, a conversation they've delayed for far too long. So they delay it again, not because they don't care, because they're ashamed. Ashamed they disappeared. Ashamed they don't know what to say. Ashamed they waited so long that coming back now feels impossible. This creates a cycle psychologists sometimes describe as an avoidance loop. The longer someone avoids a difficult situation, the more emotionally difficult that situation becomes. And eventually, the silence starts feeding itself. It's important to understand something here. Understanding isn't the same as excusing. If someone disappears and leaves another person hurting, that pain is real. Psychology doesn't erase consequences. It simply explains the mechanisms behind them. Empathy and accountability can exist at the same time. You can understand why someone behaved a certain way, while still recognizing that the behavior caused harm. Those two ideas are not enemies. They're partners. Perhaps that's one of the hardest lessons psychology teaches us. People can hurt others without intending to, and people can have understandable reasons without having acceptable actions. Both statements can be true. at the same time. We've now examined three very different minds. The one who fears confrontation, the one who struggles to recognize emotional impact, the one overwhelmed by life itself. Each leaves behind the same silence, but for completely different reasons. Which brings us to the final profile, the rarest, the most misunderstood, and, perhaps, the most dangerous, because unlike the others, this profile doesn't stumble into silence. It chooses it, intentionally. The fourth and final profile is the manipulator. Before we continue, it's important to be careful. Not everyone who disappears is manipulative. In fact, most people aren't. But psychology reminds us that some behaviors are intentional, and silence can become one of them. For some people, attention is a source of power. They've learned that uncertainty keeps people emotionally attached. So instead of offering consistency, they offer unpredictability. They disappear, then return. They become warm, attentive, present, just long enough to rebuild hope. Then they disappear again. The cycle repeats. At first, it feels confusing. Eventually, it becomes addictive. There's a psychological reason for that. Researchers call it intermittent reinforcement. Imagine a vending machine. Every time you press the button, a drink comes out. Eventually, you stop thinking about it. You expect it. Now imagine a different machine. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it gives you 2 drinks. Sometimes nothing at all. Strangely, most people keep pressing the second machine longer than the first, because unpredictability captures attention. The possibility of a reward becomes more powerful than the reward itself. Human relationships can work the same way. An occasional message, an unexpected phone call, a sudden apology. Just enough affection to keep hope alive. Never enough consistency to create security. The person waiting begins thinking, maybe this time will be different. I just need to be patient. They'll come back. Sometimes they do, but the pattern rarely changes. That's what makes intermittent reinforcement so powerful. It doesn't build healthy attachment. It builds emotional dependence. But here's the part many people overlook. You cannot diagnose manipulation from a single unanswered message. One moment of silence doesn't reveal someone's character. Patterns do. Consistency does. Repeated behavior does. Psychology doesn't rush to conclusions. It gathers evidence. It looks for patterns. It asks questions before making judgments. Because every case deserves investigation, not assumption. Which brings us back to Daniel. After weeks of silence, he finally accepted something that had felt impossible at the beginning. He might never know why the messages stopped. He might never receive an explanation. He might never hear the goodbye he'd been waiting for. And somehow, life continued. Not because the questions disappeared, but because they slowly lost their power. That's the strange thing about unanswered questions. They don't always need answers. Sometimes, they simply need time. Time changes the questions we ask ourselves. At first, Daniel kept asking, "Why did this happen to me?" Months later, the question became, "What did this experience teach me?" That single change changed everything. Because one question keeps you trapped in the past. The other allows you to move forward. Maybe closure isn't always something another person gives you. Maybe it's something you decide to create yourself. Not by pretending the pain never happened, not by forcing yourself to forget, but by refusing to let another person's silence become the measure of your worth. Some stories end with explanations. Others end with acceptance. And sometimes, acceptance is the only ending we're ever going to receive. Tonight's investigation is complete, not because every mystery has been solved, but because we've learned something more valuable than certainty. Behind every action, there is a mind. Behind every mind, there is a story, and behind every story, there are details most people never stop long enough to notice. This has been Mind Unraveled. Case file number 001 is now closed. Until next time, stay curious. Question what you see. Look beneath the surface, because the most important clues are almost always invisible. And remember, every mind leaves clues.